great honor to be awarded this recognition, and it's I'm particularly gratified to share it with the founders of the Brooklyn for Peace organization, and multiply gratified to be here on the 30th anniversary of the organization. That's an achievement that can't be overemphasized. If you look around the country today, the number of people involved in serious forms of activism is actually quite substantial, quite large, and probably greater than at almost any time in recent years. But there are deficiencies. One of them is that they're scattered, both in space and in time. In time, because very few organizations have the kind of continuity and commitment that the Brooklyn for Peace group has had over these years. Scattered in space, in that people don't know each other. They may be working on the same things in the same community, but they have little contact, and that, of course, magnifies across the country. I give lots and lots of talks, but over the years I've come to feel that one of the most valuable aspects of these talks is simply that it brings people together in the same community, and people that don't know each other. They may be in different neighborhoods, maybe working on slightly different matters, but they're related, and this sometimes is a way to integrate them. The lack of the kind of scattering in time has another aspect. It means that there's no historical memory. People don't recall what happened in the past. Every action tends to begin from scratch with no understanding of what worked in the past, what failed, and why, how to do things, and so on. So the persistence of a group like this is of extreme significance. Another element of that kind of scattering through time is that we tend to forget what has happened in our own history. So if you take things that are very much alive today, they have deep roots. They've been happening over and over again through American history, meaning they're kind of deeply rooted in the institutional structure and the culture and so on. These are things we have to come to understand. So right now, for example, there's an obvious confrontation between many working people and immigrants. That goes right through American history, far back as you want to go. Every group of immigrants that came in, when they became more or less established, resented and feared those who were replacing them. Go back to, say, New England or Boston in the late 19th century. The Irish were regarded as almost like African Americans. You could read signs in restaurants saying, no dogs in Irish. Some of the things that happened are pretty grotesque. So, for example, the modern medical field of gynecology was developed by highly respected researchers and physicians. You can see their painted pictures, portraits of them on the halls of Harvard Medical School, who were able to develop the techniques because they could use live subjects. The live subjects were, of course, black women, but also Irish women. They were considered fair subjects. By the time the people from Eastern and Southeast Europe were Huns, they were condemned bitterly. One of the things that overcame this was a constant worker struggle. The great labor struggles of the late 19th century, 1990s, overcame the racist and other ethnic conflicts and brought people together to work for a common cause. It happened again in the 1930s with the organization of the CIO. The U.S. has had very significant popular democratic movements. The most important of all probably was the radical farmers movement in the late 19th century. Very significant movement developed in Texas, Kansas, quite radical positions, a huge movement. It began to create links with the great workers' movement, the Knights of Labor, which also had a pretty radical program that reached out to huge numbers of people. Now, that was an opportunity for a real democratic, I can't say revival, because it would have been the first time in the United States. And it was crushed by force by the 1920s, after Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. The populist movement, the farmers' movement, had been disintegrated. The labor movement was virtually destroyed. One of the great labor historians, late David Montgomery, has an important book with some title like The Fall of the House of Labor. He's referring to the 1920s, when the labor movement was virtually destroyed. Racist anti-immigration bills were passed for the first time. There had been Oriental exclusion bills, but the first real general racist immigration law was 1924, and that was to keep out Jews and Italians. It's kind of forgotten. One of the reasons why many Jews went to the extermination camps is they couldn't be brought in here. The United States had racist laws that blocked them. That was overcome finally, much too late for many millions of people. And it's reenacted over and over. Now, these are things we should know. All of you know, I'm sure, that there's a huge curse in the society right now of a criminalization of black life, a huge incarceration rate, way beyond anything else in the world, since essentially about 1980, just about the time this group was formed, largely a consequence of Ronald Reagan's pure racist drug laws. It's designed that way on pure racist grounds, from police action, kind of thing they saw in Ferguson recently, up till through sentencing, up till later policies, many of which Clinton instituted to keep people out of public housing and so on. Well, that happens to be a reenactment of what happened after the Civil War. It's very similar to there was a period after the Civil War, about a decade, when blacks had some kind of small chance to enter the society. That was over by 1877, when an agreement was reached between North and South to permit the South to criminalize black life. And that the familiar image is the chain gang, but it was all over. The mines, industries, a large part of the American Industrial Revolution is based on slave labor. Just as early U.S. development is based on straight slavery. Cotton, remember, was the oil of the 19th century, and its availability created the modern industrial society. You take a look at the history of American blacks. The first slaves came in 1619, that's 500 years. There's been a few decades, literally, during this time when African Americans had a kind of small chance to enter American society on somewhat equal terms. Scattered elements made it through, but I'm talking about the mass of the population. These are all things we ought to know. We ought to understand them. We've got to comprehend the nature of the adversary that peace and justice movements confront. This has always been, to an unusual extent, a business-run society. The American labor history is extremely violent. Hundreds of American workers were being killed right up through the 1930s, at times when nothing like that was heard of in Europe or Australia or other countries. Even right-wing Europeans were appalled to see the way American workers are being treated. And it comes with the assault. The labor movement did reconstitute itself in the 1930s very significantly. That's why we have a New Deal measures and so on. Right after the war, they came under attack, been a huge attack ever since. The labor movement has once again been substantially disintegrated. Left parties have largely disappeared, and that's the basic reason for the lack of continuity and the lack of historical memory that goes along with it. Well, these are all things that have to be overcome. And the persistence of a group like this, what Rusty called the instinctive commitment to effective activism over a long period, 30 years, that's of no small significance. If that can be expended more widely, we have a real chance to break through the massive problems that we face today. And those are not small. There are basically two huge shadows that darken everything we pay attention to or think of. One of them is what was in fact the immediate stimulus for the organization of this group, nuclear weapons. There are some things that should be remembered. In 1983, when this group was formed, was one of those all too many moments when we came very close to total destruction through nuclear weapons. The facts should be known. They're not very well known. When Ronald Reagan came into office in the early 80s, one of his initiatives was to probe Russian defenses to try to determine what the Russians' defensive systems were. And there was a program, Able Archer it was called, to simulate nuclear attacks against Russia by air and sea to try to elicit a Russian response. Well, it turns out the Russians, now that Russian archives have come out, we know that they took it pretty seriously. Unlike the United States, Russia's quite vulnerable. And this was at a time when Pershing missiles were being installed in Europe with 5 to 10 minute flight time to Moscow, and a very warlike rhetoric on the part of the Reagan administration. What we call Star Wars is understood on all sides to be a first strike weapon. Everyone understands that. Strategic analysts on all sides. The current versions, again, are understood that way. Right in the midst of this period, we learned about a year ago, Russian automated response systems detected an incoming US missile attack. Our systems make hundreds of errors. They're aborted by human intervention, which has maybe a couple of minutes to stop sending of nuclear weapons, which ends everything. The Russian systems are undoubtedly less sophisticated than ours. They did report, the automated systems did report an ongoing missile attack right in the midst of all of this. The protocol is for the information to be given to a particular human being, whose name happened to be Stanislav Petrov, and he's supposed to hand it over to the high command, which then sends a counterattack. He decided not to transmit the information. Literally, that's why we're alive. Literally. That's 1983. That kind of thing has happened repeatedly. We're still on the verge of similar things. The Obama administration has announced a $1 trillion program for the next couple decades in upgrading nuclear weapons. The threats, the confrontation, US-Russian confrontation is not small. These kinds of things could happen again. The other major threat, and a very serious one, is environmental catastrophe. It's imminent. We can't go on like this much further. It's within a couple of decades. The problem has to be dealt with seriously. It's not. The major energy corporation, ExxonMobil, really recently just announced that they're going to devote all of their resources to what the business press calls a laser-like commitment to extracting every drop of fossil fuels out of the ground. It's well understood that most of that must remain in the ground or we're really sunk. Chevron, another major corporation, had a renewable energy program, small program, pretty profitable, but not as much as fossil fuel extraction, so they've abandoned it. and are now fully committed to fossil fuel extraction. You read the business press, say the business section of the New York Times, repeatedly, the euphoric articles about the fact that the United States is now rapidly increasing its fossil fuel production. It's becoming the world leader. We're beginning to export oil and diesel fuel abroad. We'll become the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century, under 10 feet of water by the time it's over. There is a mention occasionally of a problem, one story in the Times, New York Times, a couple weeks ago, which was gloating about the great oil production. Also pointed out, incidentally, that this is reducing prices, which is a wonderful thing, because people can drive more and use more electricity and so on. Another story in the Washington Post reported that the sale of Hummers, basically tanks, which was dead for a long time, is now increasing. Wonderful thing, sign of prosperity. The Times story did mention one problem, which it actually described as catastrophic if it occurs. There might be an oil glut. There might be too much oil. That's the world we live in, and it's deeply rooted in institutional structures. Like, you can't really blame the CEO of ExxonMobil for trying to destroy the world. They have a legal obligation to do it. Literally. I mean, it's a legal requirement for the CEO of a corporation to maximize profit and market share. If this particular individual doesn't do it, he'll be kicked out, and somebody else will come in who will. These are institutional problems, not easy to dismantle. If we can go on and on. If you look at popular attitudes, a very important fact is that the public is opposed to these things. This is true in international affairs. Like, this considerable majority of the public thinks that the United States should not take the initiative in international crises. It should leave it to the United Nations, which is our legal commitment, in fact. And there's even a small majority in favor of abandoning the veto at the Security Council and just following general opinion, even if we don't like it. A large percentage of the population, overwhelming majority, thinks that the environmental crisis is serious and we have to do something about it. These voices don't influence policy, and we have to ask why. There's several reasons, and they're hard to deal with. They're not going to be easy to overcome. One reason is that we simply don't live in a functioning democracy. Take a look at academic political science literature. It shows very convincingly that about 3/4 of the population, lowest 3/4 on the income wealth scale, have absolutely no influence on policy. Their political representatives simply disregard them. There's no correlation between their goals and their interests and the policies pursued. As you move up the ladder, you get a little bit more influence. And when you get to the very top, which, as Partha said, is a fraction of 1%, they basically set policy. Well, under those circumstances, it doesn't really matter much what people think. This last election had the lowest participation since the middle of the Second World War, where people weren't voting for lots of reasons. Nobody's analyzed exactly why, but I think a fair guess is that without reading technical articles, people are well aware of the fact that it doesn't matter what they think. Nobody's going to pay attention to them anyway, so why bother? There used to be a quip in the United States, I think it goes back to C. Wright Mills, that the U.S. is a one-party state, the business party, with two factions, Democrats and Republicans. That's not true anymore. It's still a one-party state, but there's only one faction, and it's not Democrats. It's moderate Republicans. That's the so-called Democratic Party. Republican Party has simply drifted off the spectrum. It's one of the leading conservative commentators, most respected commentators, Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, describes today's Republican Party as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary politics and is very successful at it. The attack on Obama, which is pretty interesting. I mean, it's kind of painful to watch, but it's interesting from a historical point of view. A lot of it's infected by racism, undoubtedly. It's a very racist society. But a lot of it followed a very successful strategy, which was announced right away. Strategy was ruin the country and hope that it'll be blamed on the guy in the White House, tinged by racist elements which are always there. It worked, partly because the Democrats offered nothing in response. They offered nothing to the poor and working people. This organization was founded in 1983, 84. That's right at the kind of onset of the general neoliberal assault on the population, which has had very harsh effects here and everywhere else where it's been applied. You take a look at, say, the real wages of male workers. For the majority, it's about like the 1960s. Productivity has increased sharply, but the results are, the outcome is not going to the people who are working. It's going to a tiny fraction of the population who are basically predators. The financialization of the economy has created enormous power in the hands of financial institutions, which for the most part are destructive to the economy. One of the leading financial economists, Martin Wolf, Financial Times, pretty conservative guy, describes contemporary financial institutions as like the larva of a spider wasp, which eats away at the host being the productive economy. There was a recent study of the IMF of the 6 leading American banks, which found that their profits derive almost entirely from the government insurance policy. It's not just the bailouts, it's a small part of it. Cheap credit, high credit ratings, all sorts of things. The business press estimates that gift that you're giving to the banks at about $83 billion a year. They're destroying the predatory institutions supported by the public by all sorts of ways, have enormous political power, and are very destructive of the economy and this social system. So why aren't people doing something? Well, for one thing, their votes don't matter, and they know it. But there's another reason which is just as hard to deal with, I think. The United States, throughout its history, has been a very frightened society, unusually so. It goes right back to colonial times. So you read, say, Thomas Jefferson, who, slave owner, of course, but did sometimes say we should do something about emancipation of slaves. But he said there's a real problem. He said the slaves have 10,000 reminiscences. They know the torture that we've imposed on them, and they might strike back. So we're in trouble. That right through American popular literature, you see tremendous fear of Native Americans who were exterminating, might fight back, slaves who might remember what we've done to them, which is hideous, and react. Late 19th century Chinese workers, you think they're building laundries, but they're really planning to wipe us out, right up to the present. And it works in the most astonishing ways. Like take Grenada, which right at the time when this organization was formed, Reagan decided to invade a great powerhouse, the nutmeg capital of the world, with 100,000 people. People didn't laugh. All he had to do was say, somebody's built, the Cubans are building an air base, commercial air base, it turned out. And maybe the Russians might use it to attack us. So therefore, 6,000 American special forces had to invade Grenada, receive 8,000 medals of honor for their achievement, overwhelm a couple of dozen Cuban construction workers. The Reagan administration rejected, pretended it didn't hear Cuban offers to settle it beforehand. Turned out to be, of course, a commercial airline, but it worked. A couple of years later, 1985, Reagan declared a national emergency in the United States because of the threat to our national security posed by the government of Nicaragua. Those of you who are old enough will recall that he made a speech warning that the Nicaraguan army is only 2 days' march from Harlingen, Texas. But the important thing is that people don't laugh, and it comes right to the present. Take the Ebola scare. 3 Americans were infected, and it's perfectly well known how to handle the Ebola crisis. It's not a serious one for a society that had any kind of a functioning health system. Countries like Mali and Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, they were able to handle it without hysteria. Here you've got mass hysteria. These things are not insignificant. It means that doesn't matter what people think, anytime that the political leadership, and of course the media chime in right away, and the intellectual community, anytime they announce we're under threat, we're about to be destroyed, people huddle under the umbrella of power. Doesn't matter what they think. That's a part of the reason for the gun culture. There are just lots of people in the country who think if I don't bring my gun into church, maybe they'll come after me, whoever they are. That's not a joke. And to overcome these things requires a major cultural change, a kind of spiritual revival, you might call it. Not a small task. All of these things, the lack of democratic institutions, the fact that we actually live in a plutocracy, the culture, the lack of historical memory, the failure to understand the nature of the adversary that we're confronting, these are hard tasks. You can think of ways in which they can be overcome, and they'd better be overcome, and pretty fast, or we're in deep trouble.